Part 6. The General. Reseda, California. Saturday, 10:58 a.m. The Ramones' I Wanna Be Sedated blasted from a boombox in an open garage in a slightly run-down suburban neighborhood. Front lawns were being watered. Children were riding bikes in complex patterns, weaving around people washing their cars in their soapy driveways. The sky was a rare blue, the light wind coming in through the pass pushing the smog all the way back to San Bernardino. Inside the garage, half listening to the thudding distortion masquerading as music, John Connor expertly adjusted the carburetor on his Honda 125 dirt bike. His long, stringy hair framed a sullen mouth and eyes that revealed a surprising intelligence for a 10-year-old. Yet, from a distance, dressed as he was in a cut-off Public Enemy t-shirt and soiled, artfully ripped Levi's, no one could have guessed that this 10-year-old was much different from Tim, his equally scruffy friend standing nearby, idly tossing a flathead screwdriver into the air and catching it one-handed. But if you stepped closer and bothered to look, you would see a slight, dazed expression in Tim's eyes. In John's, you would see knowledge and memories far too complex and severe for one so young. A 33-year-old woman appeared in the doorway of the garage. Janelle Voigt used to be cute. She'd always had dates her senior year in high school, but she was never considered particularly smart. Unarmed with a savvy comprehension of the continual downpour of trivial day-to-day disappointments, her natural ebullience had been eroded with a harsh recognition that life wasn't going to get any better than it always had been, which had been mildly disappointing. She had no idea why this had to be, and it disturbed her. Janelle had become increasingly irritable over the years until now her fuse was woefully short. In the process, her cuteness had melted away, leaving a firm, cruel set to her mouth, and a dullness to her eyes that sometimes reminded John of a cow absently feeding on the side of a hill. One of her disappointments had been her inability to bear children. That was why she had signed up for the foster parent program. That was why she was now John's guardian. And that was why she was standing there with a graceless scowl and frazzled hair. John Connor had seemed, at first, a vulnerable, shy youth, desperate for some basic affection. While that may have been true, he was also spirited, moody, independent to a fault, and mostly a brat. In the last few months, Janelle's patience had already worn thin. This morning, it was tearing. The problem was, however much she wanted a child, she was emotionally ill-equipped to raise one. And of course, she had no idea who the boy now prematurely aging her really was, or would be. The general of a vast multinational army comprised of people much like herself. But that was far away, and not yet. She had to shout over the music, "John, get in here right now and clean up that pigsty of yours." Tim heard, but John acted as if he hadn't. "John!" Janelle screamed, using the voice, sharp with ultimate authority, primed with all kinds of unspoken threats only an adult knows how to unleash. But John replied by turning up the volume on his boombox. Tim hid a grin behind his hand. "I know you can hear me. Turn that music off and get in here." But John racked the Honda's throttle, racing the engine. Janelle caught Tim's expression and narrowed her eyes. "What are you laughing at?" Tim leaned closer to John, ducking out of sight behind the bike's gas tank. Janelle angrily gave up with a slam of the house's front door. Tim waited until he was sure she was really gone, then said, "She must be on the rag today." John seemed to have no overt reaction, as if he had funneled his concern, if he had any, into a convenient storage compartment in his brain, ready to be taken out later for objective perusal. "Give me that screwdriver," was all he said. Tim instinctively handed it to him. Although he was 2 years older than John, He was the follower. John had a tone of voice, a look in his eyes, and a knowledge of things that made him a natural leader, no matter how much he resisted it. Janelle stormed into the living room. Todd Voigt, her husband, was sprawled on the couch, quietly watching a baseball game on TV. His pale, thin face was puffy with sleep, his hair disheveled. He looked world-weary and defeated, and it wasn't even noon. He wanted so much to have a peaceful moment to digest his breakfast, but that fragile hope evaporated. "I swear I've had it with that goddamn kid. He won't even answer me." Todd couldn't really blame John. At first, he didn't answer her either. Janelle had an irritating habit of marching into your business and announcing her frustrations, as if everyone were merely pretending to do something interesting while actually waiting with bated breath to hear her latest complaint. Jesus, he thought, eyes still glued to the set. The Mets were trailing by 1, and Howard Hojo Johnson was coming up to the plate, and he looked like he was going to kill the ball. "Todd, are you just going to sit there on your butt, or are you going to do something?" Todd held off answering as long as he could. Then, before she could get uglier, he sighed. "Okay, what do you want him to do?" "He hasn't cleaned his room in a month." "Well, that's an emergency," he muttered. Todd glanced around the unkempt living room and added, under his breath, "Especially around here." Luckily, Janelle didn't hear the last. She had her hands on her hips. Once, he'd loved kissing those hips. The fun sure drained out of his marriage fast, he thought. And when John came into their lives, the downward slope of their union had seemed to steepen. He threw down the TV remote and headed for the garage. John heard the door close. He rapidly finished tightening a screw and tossed the screwdriver into the open toolbox. Todd walked into view just as John was kicking the toolbox, his toolbox, across the stained concrete floor. "Look at all this oil! I told you not to work on that thing in here!" "Get my bag," John barked to Tim. The boy slipped onto the bike behind John, grabbing a nylon knapsack. John brought the engine up to redline. Over the screaming mechanical whine, Todd yelled, "John, get your ass inside right now and do what your mother says." John pinned Todd with a defiant glare. "She's not my mother, Todd." The boy released the clutch and peeled out of the garage, almost flipping Tim off the back. Todd dodged as they raced past him down the driveway. "Stay off the street with that thing till you get a license," he shouted as they accelerated away, making a couple of college students on 10 speeds scramble out of the way. Todd felt like a fool standing there. The little prick loved to humiliate him in front of his friend. But in a way, he felt relieved. John was gone now, and therefore any further confrontation was delayed until he returned later that night. Until then, Todd could watch TV and maybe get a quick nap. If Janelle would only zip her lip. John was a natural on the dirt bike, leaning comfortably into corners, alert for the child or car that might suddenly lurch into view, yet willing to take calculated risks for the sheer exhilaration of it. He wheeled down the quiet streets and veered into a vacant lot to a trail that ran beside a fenced-in drainage canal. He gunned the bike through a hole in the mesh, accelerating rather than slowing. Tim reflexively tucked his knees as they roared past the edges. That was only John pushing it to the absolute edge. Tim was determined not to let his concern for self-preservation show, but he couldn't help his eyes going wide when John roared down the concrete embankment as if they would never stop. They zigzagged along the drainage canal, which John used as his private road to avoid being tagged by cops, veering to within inches of the straight-up 13-foot-high concrete walls, throwing up a rooster tail of muddy water. Tim whooped, pretending he just didn't see his lie flash before his eyes. He slapped John on the back. "Major moves, man!" They hit a small puddle, and the Honda slid sideways, threatening to go down. but John casually jammed his foot down and immediately righted the motorbike. Tim gulped and then tried a laugh. It came out like a croak. To cover, he yelled a question. "Hey, where's your real mom anyway?" When John didn't answer, going into one of his somber moods, Tim pressed harder, a little irritated. "Well? Is she dead or something?" "She might as well be," he said, so quietly Tim wasn't sure he'd said anything. Sometimes the kid got real rigid, like steel, and nothing could break through. Tim was about to say something else when John suddenly twisted the throttle all the way, and they lunged forward. Tim shut up and held on.